Hello and welcome to this short overview of the triangle trade and mercantilism. As always, a PDF of this presentation is available in the show notes if you'd like to follow along and jot down things as I mention them. So, mercantilism in its end is really an economic system. It's an economic system that you kind of want to imagine like a set of scales. So, you have a positive side and you have a negative side. And this idea is very much called a balance of trade. That's why the scale analogy works so well. So, the goal of different nation states, and these ideas do precede Columbus's discovery of the New World by a little bit, but they really get kicked into high gear when different kingdoms in Europe start establishing colonies in the New World, and I'll explain why. So, this idea of the balance of trade is that you should export more than you import in terms of value, not overall quantity. So, if you are exporting valuable finished goods and importing less valuable raw materials, your overall ledger is going to look good. So, let's just take England and France as an example. England wants to try to import less items of value than it exports to France, and vice versa. So, in sort of a simplistic term, that's what the balance of trade is. And that is what mercantilism is to a large extent. Now, there's a couple of other key parts to this. And one of the key parts is protectionism. Protectionism is trying to make sure that your homegrown industries don't get drowned out by the importation of foreign goods. Let me give you an example. If, let's just use England again as our example kingdom. If England wants to be a major producer of textiles, clothing, England doesn't want cheaper textiles, i.e., clothing, coming in from another country. And the reason is then your consumers will buy those goods and not support your own native companies that are producing the same thing. So, how do you protect your industry? The answer is simple, and it's called a tariff. We still have tariffs today. A tariff is a tax on an imported good. How it works is pretty simple. The country, and let's just use England again, that's importing those textiles, let's say they put a 10% tariff on there. Now, tariffs are actually paid by the consumer. So the intention here isn't really to make money for the government. The government, this isn't a primarily at least a money making tool for governments. It is a tax, yes, but it's a tax with a purpose. The tax is intended to protect that industry at home. So if you were, say, selling shirts in England for $100 and shirts that were coming in from France, let's say, were $90. You could deal with this situation very simply by putting a 20% tariff on the French shirts, increasing their price to over $100. So a commodity, in this case shirts, that was cheaper gets a tariff slapped on it. That tariff makes it more expensive. All right. So it's a way for governments to try to exert some control over their industry at home. So, how does this come to play in colonialism? So, the way that this works in colonialism is there's sort of a symbiotic relationship between the mother country and the colonies. So, England is going to establish colonies along what is today the eastern seaboard of the United States. England is by and large interested in exporting finished goods. So your colony benefits you in two key ways, then, as we'll talk about in a second with the triangle trade. Number one, your colony becomes an incredible source of raw materials. England can import things like timber. England can import things like sugar, although they don't for reasons that I'll talk about in just a second, fish, furs, things like that. England can take those products, those furs, they can turn them into clothing, and then they can export them and make more money. So that's one way. The other way that the colony helps the mother country is that the colony is essentially, in many cases, forced to purchase finished goods from the home or mother country. So the colony, let's just say Virginia, for the sake of argument. So this is on the eastern seaboard. So Virginia can't buy furniture from France. People who live there can't buy furniture from Spain. They can only buy furniture from England. And what that does is it sort of unnaturally boosts your balance of trade as a home country. And it is a double whammy because you can import really cheap lumber from a place like Virginia or New England, and then you turn around, produce furniture, and sell it back to the same colony, making a profit twice over. So that's why mercantilism becomes the dominant economic model going forward. It's very simplistic, and there's a lot of problems to it, but these are things that the people at the time simply wouldn't have understood. So mercantilism leads to this thing called the triangle trade. The triangle trade is sort of an economic model based off of what different areas produce. So the trade goes from typically Europe to the west coast of Africa and then to the Americas. And one leg of the trade is essentially a one trick pony. The middle passage, as I'll talk about in just a second, is the passage from West Africa to the Americas. And that is predominantly human cargo. Those are enslaved Africans who are sold to plantations, mostly at first in the Caribbean, but eventually in the American South. Now, as the people from Europe come over to the New World, they get all this land, but Native Americans, through war, famine, and a lot because of disease, quickly die off, which leaves Europeans with a lot of land, but no one to work the land. They solve this problem in a number of ways, and when we look at the triangle trade, the predominant way that they solve the problem is through enslaved humans. They used enslaved humans to grow sugarcane. That's the number one cash crop in this time period in the Caribbean. The sugarcane then goes some to Europe, but a lot to the Americas, where it is turned into rum. Rum is then exported back to Europe, where it can get turned around to West Africa for more slaves. And I won't go through everything that's on the chart there because you can see it. But the idea is, again, grounded in mercantilism to make sure that the home or mother country back in Europe has the most favorable balance of trade possible. And the way to do that is to make sure that finished goods are produced in that mother country. And that's the way that the triangle trade facilitates this economic growth throughout this time period. And this model, by and large, is going to remain in effect right up until the American Revolution, when the American successful revolution and its end in 1783 brings an abrupt end to the triangle trade. But I want to talk for another few minutes about the middle passage, because it's easy to look at the charts and look at dollars and cents and think, well, this was, a positive economic model for these kingdoms in Europe. And from a purely economic standpoint, of course it was, but it had an enormous cost. And the enormous cost that it had was in the form of human beings. That middle passage, where enslaved Africans were sent to the Caribbean and eventually to the Americas, was harrowing, to say the least. I mean, I probably don't need to tell you, but these aren't luxury cruise ships. They're not even cruise ships necessarily designed for the transportation of human beings, because the same ship that takes enslaved Africans from the west coast of Africa to, say, what is today Cuba, is then going to pick up sugar cane and sugar and rum and take that to the Americas, where it's going to get loaded up with fish and timber and cotton. And then that's going to go over to Europe. And then that's going to get loaded up with guns and rum and other things to trade for more African slaves. So that same ship is used throughout this process. It's not designed to hold human beings. And so you'll notice on the bottom of the slide, there's this tight versus loose pack system. Most captains were what's called tight pack. And what that meant was enslaved Africans, and it's mostly males, who were taken in that middle passage, which could last weeks, were laid on their sides. So rather than on their backs. So you're literally packing them in like pieces of wood. As you can imagine, this resulted in a tremendous loss of life. Estimates are impossible during this time period to be certain about, but most historians expect somewhere between a 10 to 20% mortality rate for those in the Middle Passage. So one out of either every 5 or 1 out of every 10 persons died. This is a long time. The Middle Passage is going on in parts of West Africa, and a little bit in Angola, where Portuguese are operating, but their slave trade is mostly from Angola to what is today Brazil. And it lasts a long time, and it lasts really until the end of the American Civil War. And at the end, what we're talking about is 12.5 million Africans being transplanted from Africa, predominantly from the West Coast, to the New World. And those are almost exclusively males. And that matters because if you're taking even numbers, males and females, the population can recover a lot faster. If you take only one sex, male or female, then there's just less people to reproduce. And so it takes Africa a long time to recover from this situation. And there are many historians who would still argue today that parts of Africa still haven't recovered, given how long and how brutal the system went through. There's a lot of other pieces of information available about the Middle Passage, but this gives you a quick once over of how that fits into the triangle trade and how that is driven by mercantilism.